up to another good morning. Time to go.
Are you ready to explore God's wild and wonderful world? Welcome to the Nat Theo podcast. I'm your host, Eryn. I'm a certified master naturalist, Bible teacher, and author. And I am so excited to dive into God's written word, the Bible, and his created world with you. Have you ever heard someone say that something is a no-brainer? What do you think that means? Something that is a no-brainer is usually something that is so obvious or easy to know that you don't really have to use your brain to think about it. So someone might say, it's a no-brainer that ice cream is delicious. But do you know what's funny about that example? When we eat ice cream, tiny taste buds on our tongues send messages to our brain to tell us how tasty it is. So actually, saying it's a no-brainer that ice cream is delicious isn't exactly true because our brains are working hard to tell us what it tastes like. In fact, saying that something is a no-brainer is not very accurate in most cases because our brains are always hard at work. Our brains are incredible machines that God has designed us with. But if I can use the saying, then it is a no-brainer that the creature we are learning about today is an amazing part of God's creation. And one reason is because this creature doesn't have a brain. And yet, as we will discover, God designed these creatures to live well even without brains. Do you have any idea what this creature might be? Today, we are learning all about jellyfish, or maybe more accurately, we can call them jellies, because as we will find out, they are not fish at all. I am so excited to introduce you to our guest scientist, Sherri Seligson. She has had some very interesting and fun jobs. Sherri is a marine biologist, or a scientist who studies God's creatures in the ocean. She worked as a marine biologist at Walt Disney World's Living Seas Pavilion. She has also authored several books and courses on the ocean, including a new children's book coming out in January that I am so excited about. It is called Wonders of the Ocean Realm, and it's for 8 to 12-year-olds. What fun jobs Sherri has had. Have you ever thought about becoming a marine biologist or a teacher or an author? You definitely can, especially as you keep learning and studying God's wild and wonderful world. Another job that Sherri has had is writing several middle school and high school curriculums and courses for Apologia curriculum, which my family uses for our science studies. If you have an interest in nature or science, and especially if you are thinking about having a job in science when you get older, Apologia's award-winning science curriculum is a fantastic resource to help you on your way. We have used several of Apologia's science courses, and I am constantly amazed at how they teach my kids and me real science while keeping us engaged and inspired, and always pointing us back to our Creator God. Apologia also offers curriculum for math and Bible and has live classes that teach history, government, Spanish, language arts, and more, and all from a biblical worldview. Find it all at apologia.com. So what kind of creature do you think a jellyfish is? Or is it even a creature if it doesn't have a brain? You might remember way back on episode 11, we learned that mushrooms and fungus do not have brains. So is a jellyfish closer to fungus? Or maybe a plant, since those don't have brains either? Jellyfish are certainly unique, and they can be a bit confusing. And their name, jellyfish, doesn't exactly help because they are not fish. Today, Sherri is going to help us untangle some of the confusion around jellyfish and better understand how God designed these fascinating creatures. Here's our trail map. We are going to learn what kind of creature is a jellyfish and how do jellyfish sting. We will learn how does a jellyfish grow up, what is an immortal jellyfish, and finally, how can we live forever? You know, listener, as cool as jellyfish are, I am very glad that I am a human and not a jellyfish. I really like using my brain. Because God gave humans very powerful brains, we can understand and learn about the world around us, like you're doing right now listening to Nat Theo, or when you venture outside into God's creation. Our brains are always hard at work learning, even when we're playing and having fun. Did you know that you can also train and strengthen your brain? One way we do that is by feeding our brains. And no, I don't mean like giving our brains food, although there are certain foods that can help our brains. But by feeding our brains, I mean taking in great resources that teach us truth and point us to goodness. My kids and I love feeding our brains goodness and truth with resources from ChristianBook.com. It can be hard to find good books, especially because I want to make sure the books my family is reading have great stories that share truth, beauty, and wisdom. So when I am looking for good books, I browse ChristianBook.com. I use their online and print catalogs to find books that I feel really good about my kids reading. Books that I know will feed their brains and their hearts and help them grow in their mind and spirit. For your next great read or curriculum or toys or gifts, visit ChristianBook.com. All right, listener, here is our trivia question. What is a group of jellyfish called? So think about a herd of cows or a flock of birds or a colony of ants. What do you think a group of jellyfish is called? Take a guess and we will find out toward the end of our episode. Okay, listeners, now it's time to bring on our special guest, marine biologist Sherri Seligson. We are so excited to have you on to teach us about a very special creature called a jellyfish or jelly. So let's start simple. Can you just explain to us what kind of creature is a jellyfish?
Yeah. So first of all, a jellyfish is not a fish, even though they're called jellyfish. They are in a group of animals that we call cnidarians. And you have probably talked to your listeners about how we group animals into different groups based on similarities in the way that God's designed them. And in the same way that you will group different clothes, your clothes in different places in your bedroom, you put your pajamas one place and your shoes in another place based on what their use is for and how they look. And so we do the same thing with animals to better understand them. And so jellyfish are in a group of animals that we call cnidarians, and that's the same group um, that has sea anemones and corals. But jellyfish don't have a backbone, no bones in their body at all. So fishes do. And then jellyfish don't breathe through their gills like fish. They don't have lungs. They actually take in oxygen straight out of the water. So they're just really, really soft bodied creatures. Again, similar to corals and sea anemones. Now, jellyfish all live in salt water. So some types of other cnidarians can live in fresh water, but all jellyfish live in salt water, but they live all over the place in the oceans, way down in the deep, shallow water near the shoreline, all over the world, cold climates, warmer climates. They're found everywhere. So they're very amazing animals to be able to survive like that in all of those different places. And they have a stomach that's kind of like a bag with one opening. That's their mouth. Okay, the mouth is in the center of their body. So their stomach is kind of a sac, and the mouth is on the underside, and it's surrounded by long tentacles. And so that is one characteristic of them. They also have mostly clear bodies, but some of them have some colors. They can be bright blues and pinks. Some of them can even glow. They can create their own light, which is called bioluminescence. And have you ever talked with your listeners about bioluminescence and what that means? What it is with animals?
Yeah, we have a little bit when we looked at fireflies. We did an episode on fireflies or lightning bugs and God's living light, that he created this chemical reaction inside of these creatures to really produce their own light. Is
Yes.
it like that with
It's
the
very
jellyfish?
similar with jellyfish. They have two different chemicals that mix together. And most of the bioluminescent animals in the world are in the oceans because if you think about it, the oceans below a certain level of depth are they're very dark, like can't penetrate that deep. And so
Mhm.
bioluminescence helps animals do lots of things. For jellyfish, they'll use their bioluminescence to surprise their predators, something that might want to eat them. If it's dark in the water and there's this flash of light, think of like a surprise light bulb flash in your
Mhm.
face and you can't see for a minute or two. That's kind of what the bioluminescence will do with the jellyfish so that it startles their predators and gives the jellyfish a chance to float away. Some
Oh,
jellyfish
wow.
even have glowing tentacles that they'll release a tentacle intentionally and that glowing tentacle will float away so that hopefully the predator will go
Whoa.
after the tentacle and leave the jellyfish alone because jellyfish can't swim like fishes can swim.
Yeah.
They're actually called part of the plankton. And when we think of plankton are usually little tiny microscopic creatures that live in the water and float along. And can't swim against the ocean currents. Well, the definition of plankton are creatures that can't swim faster than the currents of water moving in the ocean.
Mm.
Jellyfish can't, for the most part, can't swim faster than that. So jellyfish are actually considered plankton. They can't swim faster than the currents take them along. And so by having the ability to startle their predators with bioluminescence or send out a glowing tentacle, then they
Mhm.
have a chance to survive better. God's given them that beautiful ability. They also have another amazing ability because their tentacles are covered with stinging cells called nematocysts. And we'll talk about those in a little bit, I think. But that
Oh,
is
wow.
also a method of protection and a way for them to get their food. So they, like I said, they have a sac in their body with a single opening, which is their mouth, and they actually squirt water out of their mouth for jet propulsion to move in the
Like a
water a
squirt
little
gun.
bit. Yeah, like a squirt gun. That's right. And so they can move a little bit. And if you ever see a jellyfish in an aquarium or somewhere, you're usually going to see their the top of their body, which is called the bell, kind of moving like this and pulsing. And
Mhm.
so they can kind of swim like this, kind of pulsing up there. They're using that little jet propulsion to move. They don't move like a jet. They're not fast, but that's
Okay.
what they use their jet propulsion for. Um, and it pumps water in and out. Some of them will filter plankton out of the water and other things, but it also helps them get rid of wastes and digest
Mm.
of their digested food because they take water into their stomach and then they pump that water out, which gets rid of the wastes that they had produced from the food that they have.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
so, and they don't really hunt. Most of them don't have eyes. There are a couple that do, but most jellyfish don't have eyes to see and they can't swim fast. So they really can't hunt like looking for food. So they really have to wait until something comes near them where their tentacles will
Hmm.
capture their food. But that again, God designed them to do that. He designed them to capture their food that way and then to basically hide in plain sight in the ocean by being mostly
Wow.
clear so that they can survive.
So those jellyfish that will let go of a glowing tentacle, just crazy. Will they grow those back? Because
They
they need them,
can.
right?
Yes, they can grow them back.
Okay.
Um, Not as well as there's some animals that can regrow body parts much more readily than others.
Mhm.
Starfish can do that. If you're familiar with lizards, a lizard's
Yeah.
tail will pop off sometimes, and they do that so they can get away and they'll regrow a new
Yeah.
tail.
We did a whole episode on axolotls and how they do
Axolotl.
that and how they're
Yes.
like the first prize at regeneration. So,
Yes, they can
yeah,
regenerate
fascinating.
amazingly. And so many animals have that ability and jellyfish do as well. Thankfully, they don't do it as readily or as much or as fast as maybe an axolotl might. But if you think about it, they have lots and lots of tentacles. So
Yeah.
it's not critical that they grow that one back right away. So they can do
Okay.
without one or two tentacles fine for the rest of their lives because many of them have hundreds of tentacles. So they
Yeah,
can
yeah.
survive
So
well. Yes.
so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So, can you
Yeah.
tell us a little more about these stinging nettles that jellyfish
Yes.
have?
Yeah, they're called nematocysts. And so if you there's little compartments that are located on their tentacles. And the compartments are actually they contain a stinger that's all coiled up and ready to shoot out, okay? And it's triggered by either touch or by a chemical, depending on the kind of jellyfish. They can't control when they sting. So you're never going to get a jellyfish coming up to you like wanting to sting you. It's
Oh, wow.
literally triggered by either a touch or by a chemical, depending on the species. And they do it for two reasons. They will either use it for capturing their food. So if a fish swimming by or a shrimp or something gets caught in their tentacles, the nematocysts will fire and the venom will cause them to be immobilized and they can eat their food. But it's also used as protection from predators. So that again helps them to keep their predators are sea turtles or sharks or large
Mm.
tuna. Even penguins will feed on
Oh, wow.
jellyfish. And so many of those predators can endure a couple stings here and there, but most of them don't like it. And if there's a lot of jellyfish in the area, they probably won't eat them because it's just too much, too painful for them to go after it. So let me talk
Yeah.
about how those nematocysts work. So the compartments
Yeah.
have that pointy stinger all coiled up inside, and then they're triggered by touch, and they shoot out like a harpoon when it's touched or when a chemical comes across, and it shoots out like a harpoon. The harpoon enters the skin of whatever it's touched, and then injects a venom that can be painful, depending on how strong that venom is whether a jellyfish is considered a dangerous jellyfish or one that just maybe could hurt you a little bit. So when we're talking about people and jellyfish, we probably don't want to touch any of them because all of them have nematocysts and all of them can literally get those little harpoons stuck into our skin. But some of those stingers are very short. Some of those stingers are long. Some of them have stronger venom than others. And so when we know different types of jellyfish, we can talk about some of the ones to be a little bit more concerned about. But again, if those harpoons are very, very small, you might feel, if your skin touched it, you might feel a little tingling sensation. But if their nematocysts have harpoons that are very long, then you can feel a very, very painful sting. And
Okay.
actually, those tentacles, sometimes a tentacle will get broken off from a jellyfish if it's caught up in turbulent waves or something like that, and a couple of tentacles will break off. If those tentacles float along in the ocean and you're swimming in the ocean and a tentacle touches you, it still can sting you because if
Oh,
those
wow.
nematocysts haven't had time, like if once it breaks off of the animal, it's the tissue is still living, it's still alive for a while. And so
Okay.
those harpoons could still hurt us. So you never want to touch one intentionally, okay? Most
Okay.
jellyfish will cause our skin to be irritated. And now some jellyfish stings can actually be deadly. There are certain species of
Mm.
jellyfish. Some of the more notorious ones are called box jellyfish. And so scientists study where those guys live and warn people if they notice a lot of them in the area. They'll say, hey, this is an area you probably don't want to go swimming in. And they're mostly found near Australia and the Indian and Pacific Ocean, where the two
Mhm.
oceans meet in that area. Box jellies do have eyes. Remember how I said they don't have eyes? Box
Yeah.
jellyfishes do have eyes, and they can swim much faster than most other jellyfish. But they have very short nematocysts. Their venom is strong, but their
Mhm.
nematocyst stingers are short. So they literally can't sting through bathing suit material. So a
Oh,
lot of
wow.
people that swim in areas where there are box jellyfishes will wear a full lycra suit, like a one-piece
Yeah.
bathing suit that covers your arms and legs, and that
Yeah.
will protect them from the box jellies that might be in the area. So
Oh, wow.
the more we study them, the more we can keep everybody safe, and the more we can
Yes.
learn about those abilities. Some of those chemicals that the stinging venom can be helpful. That scientists are studying what that venom does and how we can maybe create a medicine out of it to help somebody who's in pain and we want to alleviate that pain. So there's a lot of studies and that's what I love about studying our world because God has given us a beautiful world filled with all kinds of creatures and
Mhm.
they're for our good. And so we can learn about them and appreciate the complexity that they have, but we also can use them to help people. And so that's a really fun part of studying the oceans and studying the
Yeah.
creatures that are there.
Yeah, I love that. Even going back to, I mentioned the axolotl in the episode we did on those, and of course those are in freshwater lakes or when they were, and we learned that scientists are studying axolotls for cancer treatment because they are so much they're better able to fight off or not get cancers than humans. And so they're looking
Yes,
at, okay, how is this? And I love that as well. Just when we look at nature and creation, God has so masterfully designed everything. And then as we learn about it, we can use it for our own solutions. Okay,
yes,
I had this thought when you were talking about how the jellyfish stings and those harpoons, and that it's really a reaction, that they're not
yes.
intentionally doing that because jellyfish don't have brains. Is that true?
That's right. They don't have brains. And so they can't think like we would think, like, I'm in danger. I need to protect myself. It's an automatic reaction that God has given them that they don't need their brains. They don't need brains. They're perfectly designed to live without brains. But that's right. They can't intentionally sting because they don't have the capacity to know that. So in that respect, they're simplified animals, but there is no simple animal. Every creature is complex because they have the beautiful, complex design of, for example, just the nematocysts. The nematocysts are very complex and little machines that they have in their bodies that do the job of protection for them.
Yeah, well, it even
Yeah.
makes me think of what you mentioned about them being in the plankton family because they can't swim against the current. Like they
Yes.
kind of just go with the flow. And I imagine that even helps them. If they don't have brains, they can't be thinking, I'm going to go this direction, but the current can really take them.
That's true. That's right. Yeah. They don't have to stress
Wow.
out about where they're going to be. They just kind of go where the currents take them. That's right.
Yeah.
Very, but sometimes we need to be like jellyfish, don't we? And just kind of chill out a
Yeah.
little bit
Yeah,
and not
exactly.
fight
Good
what's
point.
happening around us. That's right. We can
Good
learn a lot.
point. Well, Sherry, can you please explain how a jellyfish grows up? Because I was reading about their life cycle and it's quite fascinating.
It is, and actually quite complex. We're going to go over just the basic. I'll talk about the basic way they reproduce, but there's
Okay.
lots of other ways they can reproduce on top of that. So, the main way, let me first talk about their body shape. So, there's two major forms that jellyfish can take. In fact, all cnidarians, remember the we've talked about corals and sea anemones and jellyfish. So, there's two major forms their bodies can take, and one is called a medusa and one is called a polyp. Jellyfish, their adult life are spent as a medusa stage. And so if you imagine my hand like this is my jellyfish with the little tentacles hanging down. This is the
Like you said, with the
medusa.
big bell on top,
That's the
right?
bell on top. That's
Okay.
right. And the tentacles hanging down. And so this is the jellyfish adult form. It's called a medusa. And then the other form is called a polyp. And it's basically just the jellyfish upside down like this with the central mouth and the tentacles coming up. And so this would be like a sea anemone. An adult sea anemone is, and most corals as well, have that polyp form most of their lives. The jellyfish have the medusa form most of their lives. So these are what we call the adult jellyfish, like this in the medusa stage. And so sometimes, most of the time, they'll when they are ready to reproduce, they'll release their eggs into the water, just release them out there. And when the eggs become fertilized, they'll start to grow into a tiny little larval form. And this little larval form is called a planula. And it just looks like a little oval shape covered in tiny little hairs. They're called cilia. And it floats along with the plankton until it
Hmm.
hits a hard surface, usually a rock underwater or maybe some shells or something. So when it bumps into a hard surface, it will attach and then transform itself, like totally change its body shape into that little tiny polyp. So it
Wow.
starts off as this little tiny planula, like a little furry sphere or football shape, and then it hits something hard, and then it transforms its whole body into this polyp with the tentacles coming up, little tiny polyp, and it will start to grow. And as it gets bigger and bigger, it will begin to bud off or pinch off another polyp on top of it and another polyp on top of it. And you get these little stacks of polyps until the
Wow.
one on top pops off and floats around and now becomes our medusa. And now it's an adult.
Wow.
And so it will continue to go through this cycle of being a Medusa, creating eggs. The eggs then land, become a little larval form, little polyp. The polyp pops up many, many more, and then now you have Medusas floating around again. And it kind of goes in this little life cycle of
That's incredible.
yeah, it's really, really fascinating. And there are many jellyfish that we have not been able to actually observe their life cycle because when they're reproducing, the plankton are very tiny, and plankton are usually see-through and very hard to see and identify in the ocean. So we can capture, little samples of the ocean water and look at them, and it's hard to know, oh, there's a baby jellyfish because it doesn't have a name tag. We just kind of figured out. And then, or when they do land and make their little tiny polyps, they're usually very small. And again, most of the time, very clear. So they're hard to see. And so it's very difficult to identify that this is a specific species of jellyfish that's growing its little polyps and
That
its
makes
little polyps. Right.
sense.
So it's very difficult to study. Sometimes we learn more about them by bringing them into an aquarium and studying them through their life
Because then
cycles.
you know
Because
what kind it is.
that's right. Then we know what
Yeah.
kind and we can watch it. But of course, you have to have a male and a female, and you have to make sure that when they release their little baby eggs and the little fertilized eggs, that they don't get sucked into the filters of the aquarium. So
Yes.
there's a lot of things to do to be able to study creatures that are in the ocean, because we can't create an artificial ocean that has all the things that God made for an ocean. And so
Yes.
it's there's a lot more to study. There's a lot more to study,
Yeah.
especially the ones that live in very, very deep places or very, very cold places where it's hard for
Mhm.
people to be able to see
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
Well, I am sure that you have inspired some of our listeners to grow up and study jellyfish. And I'm sure they can just picture setting up these tanks and having their baby jellyfish and writing their notes. And
Yes. Yes.
what a fun
It's
job.
fun to observe, and it's really marvelous because I'm sure many of your listeners have observed how a butterfly transforms. You have a
Yeah.
caterpillar that
Yeah.
totally transforms. It turns into to goo inside this little tiny chrysalis, then becomes a butterfly. Well, this is kind of what these guys do when they're going from their planula, their little tiny larval form, into a polyp. They totally change their
Yeah.
body. And so it's just fascinating to understand how do they know? They don't even have a brain, right? And
Right.
so it's just amazing the wiring that God has given them in their cells to know what to do next. And so that
Absolutely.
that just fascinates me. That's the complexity of life. There's no simple organism in the world. Each
No, because
organism
God is so
is
detailed.
he's so detailed. And
Yeah.
so it's his testimony. So it's like if you saw a car on the side of the road, somebody made that car. It's
Mhm.
too complex to have just blown around from sand and rocks and other things. And it's the
Yeah.
same thing. You see a jellyfish and you're like, wow, this is a very complex organism. It could not have just popped up. Something
No.
made that. And so we
No.
know that God made them.
Something very smart must have made
Yes,
it.
that's right. That's right. Yes.
Well, a while back, my kids started telling me about this creature. And at the time, I didn't know anything about jellyfish. And so I didn't know if they were talking about a real creature. I was very confused because they talked about something called an immortal jelly. Can you tell us a little bit about that creature?
Yes, that is probably one of the most fascinating jellyfish that are out there. The immortal jellyfish lives in the Mediterranean Sea, which is an ocean or a sea that's just north of Africa, and near Japan. They also live near Japan. They're very small, so they're the size of maybe my pinky fingernail. So really
Oh,
tiny
wow.
little creatures. And when these jellyfish feel sick or scared, or there's no food and there's like they're starting to get starvation, they will change their body back to a young jellyfish polyp.
Oh,
So they
wow.
go from their Medusa, oh no, I'm not feeling good, and now they're going to turn into a little tiny polyp. And then if there's still difficult conditions, they'll actually become just a clump of cells and with a hardened outside to protect it
Hmm.
until it's good enough for them to pop up again. So it will wait until the conditions around it are good again, and then it can bud and make new medusas that regrow back into adults. It's the only animal in the world that we know that can do this. It basically lives on and on and on. When it gets old, it will do that little transformation and then wait until conditions are good and kind of regroup all of its cells and then make a little polyp and then form some medusas again. And so it conceivably could live forever.
Hmm.
We don't know. We're studying it. How can it do that? How can it um, rechange its cells back to baby cells all over again?
Yeah.
So there's so much to learn about it, and we know very little about it. Again, it's a little tiny, tiny guy and clear and lives in a little ocean in certain parts of the world. So we're studying this. It's not an immortal jellyfish. Like it will not live throughout
Hmm.
all of time and eternity. Only God is immortal in that respect, right? No
Yeah.
beginning, no end. But they
Yes.
can revamp their bodies to live over and over and over through many generations, as far as we know.
Yeah.
And so they're fascinating. No other animal, like I
Yeah.
said, can do that. So,
Oh my goodness. It makes me think about like I remember as a child being so excited to grow up. But now as an adult, once in a while we're like, "You know what? I don't want to pay these bills or I don't want this responsibility. Like it would be fun to just be a kid again for a day." And that's
right.
basically what the
It
jellyfish is
starts over
doing.
again. That's right. Or my
Oh
kids,
my
when they
goodness.
learned about it, they were like, it's kind of like playing a video game and having unending lives. You know, when you play the
Yeah.
video game and you end up getting caught. And so you start with a new life and you start with another
Mhm.
new life. It's like they get to do it again and again. And I'm like, well, yeah, it kind of is like that. But that's not real life, is it? In real
Right.
life, only the jellyfish can do that. People can't do that. So it's just pretty
Oh, that's
amazing.
funny. It is. Oh my goodness. Well, Sherry, is there anything else that you would like to share with us about jellyfish?
There's a couple things. So jellyfish come in all different sizes, like we talked about. Some are as tiny as my fingernail. The largest jellyfish that we know of is called the lion's mane jellyfish, and it's pretty big. It can be over 7 to 8 feet across, which is taller than me, way
Wow.
taller than me. And his tentacles can be up to 120 feet long. So they're very, very large. They're like a dark color, and they're called a lion's mane because if you think of the mane of a lion with lots and lots
Yeah.
of fur all around it, well, these guys have orangish colored long tentacles around that bell, and so they look kind of like a long lion's mane.
I just can't
um
imagine like not getting those tangled. Like I have really long hair and it just gets tangled all the time.
well, and I'd wonder, yeah, I don't know that jellyfish can brush their tentacles like we brush our
Yeah.
hair. That must be a problem. Maybe they could braid their tentacles or something and keep them in
Yes.
control.
There we go.
Yes, and then there's another very commonly mistaken creature that is mistaken as a jellyfish, and that's a Portuguese man o' war. Very well known because they do have very long stinging tentacles. They have a large float that floats at the surface of the water, on the surface, not under the water, but on the surface. It's like a balloon, and they have these long tentacles. And these Portuguese man o' war are known by swimmers at beaches to stay. You need to stay away from them if you see them because they have long stinging tentacles. But they're not jellyfish, and a lot of people think that they are jellyfish. They're in the same phylum as
Mhm.
jellyfish, but they're actually made up of a colony of multiple little polyps that live together. And each colony, each member in the colony has a different job. So some members are tentacles, some members are the float, some members are the digestive parts, and they all work
Oh,
together
wow.
as this large living colony that looks like a giant jellyfish, but it's not. So there are, again, it's a very commonly mistaken critter that is considered not a jellyfish because of its the way its body is designed, the way its body is shaped. And so I just like to share that when we talk about jellies because
Mhm.
it's technically even more complicated than a jellyfish. It's a bunch of
Yeah.
creatures all living together. But jellies are important to the ocean where they live. They provide food for large animals. They're a very important food source in the oceans. They also keep other populations, other groups of critters from getting too populated. So by eating the shrimp and the fish and the plants that they feed on, they keep those populations in check. And so we
Mm.
need jellyfish in our ocean environments because they provide food for others. They also will keep other populations from getting too big, and they're very important. If we remove them from the oceans, then some larger animals that might feed on them wouldn't have enough food source, and they could be hurt. And then other animals that they feed on would be overpopulated, and that would cause a whole host of other problems. So they're a very important part of what we call an ecosystem, which is a system of lots of little organisms that live together in their environment, their special environment. And so we want to consider them as very important animals, and they're important to study because we need them in our oceans.
I love that you brought that up because I always love thinking about ecosystems and again, just how carefully God designed them and gave all these creatures and plants specific jobs and specific places. And it's beautiful because we can look at that and remember like, oh, God has a special plan for my life. And he
That's
has
right.
me where I am for a reason. It's
That's
such a
right.
beautiful picture of that.
They're each made perfectly for what God has for them to do, just like you and I are made. We each have special gifts, special abilities, the way that God made us because he has a good purpose for us. And so it's important to remember that too.
So true.
Yes.
Well, I want to end on a question I like to ask our guests. Do you have a favorite memory in nature from your childhood?
Well, I have a couple. As a marine biologist, one of my favorite memories was for the first time as a kid, I was snorkeling in the water, in the ocean. I live in Florida, and we went to the southern part of Florida, where there's some islands called the Florida Keys. And I went with
Mhm.
my family, and we went snorkeling, and I looked under the water. When you snorkel, you're floating at the surface of the water, and you have this little tube so you can breathe air while you're floating at the surface. And I looked at the ocean, and under the ocean, and I saw a coral reef, and I saw lots of fish and all kinds of creatures. And I would hold my breath and dive down as much as I could. And I couldn't hold my breath long enough. And I would pop to the surface again. I'd go back down. And I'd have to go back to the surface. And I wanted to be down there. And it just sparked in me a curiosity because it was a whole new world of creatures, of living beings that I had never seen before. And they're very different than the creatures that are on land. Some of them are bizarre and amazing, and some of them actually can look kind of scary when you study some of the animals that are in the deep, deep, deep ocean
Yeah.
that live in very, very harsh environments. God's designed them to live there that way, but they look really different than we do,
Yes.
don't they?
Yes. Our
And
first ocean episode was on the abyss, and we looked at things like the anglerfish and the blobfish,
yes,
and they
yes.
are certainly different than what we see up here.
That's right. I mean, if you can't even imagine some of the things, and new animals are being discovered in that ocean deep every week as we send
Wow.
down cameras and scientists go down in submersibles. So that was one of the things that just sparked in me an interest in studying the world around us. And when I thought about this question, I was trying to think of a notable memory I had with a jellyfish as a kid, and there was one is on that same trip in the Florida Keys, and I knew jellyfish existed. I knew what they were, but I saw these. There's this special kind of jellyfish called an upside down jellyfish, and its species name is Cassiopeia. And I never forgot that because I thought, "Ooh,
Hmm.
Cassiopeia! That sounds like a fun name." And so that's the species name or the genus name of the upside down jellyfish, and it's given that name because it's upside down. It lives on the bottom of shallow water in the ocean, upside down, like a polyp, but it's not a polyp. Its body design is still jelly. It's got that bell, it's got the tentacles, but it floats. Sometimes it will hang out like this, but most of the time it'll hang out like this with its tentacles hanging up like this. And it's very flowery looking. It almost looks like
Wow.
little underwater vases with flowers sticking out. And they're not very venomous. So um, it's not something that you need to be afraid of in the water, but you just obviously you don't want to step on one or touch one.
Yeah.
But they're not super venomous, but they're found down in warm Caribbean waters. And I just remember thinking that is the most amazing creature I think I've ever seen when I was a
Yes.
kid. And the fact that it lives its life upside down on its head. I mean,
Yeah.
that's amazing. It's like what animal says, okay, I'm going to live upside down from now on. It's just really fun. So
Yeah.
that was a fun
Oh,
memory that I had as a kid. I had actually had a kid jellyfish memory, and that's what that one was.
I love it. Thank you so much for sharing. And thank you again for your time and your expertise and your passion for these creatures God has made. I know our listeners are going to be blessed by your knowledge and your stories. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm super happy to be here. Thank you.
Listeners, I want to encourage you to look into all of Sherri's incredible work, including her new book coming out in January, Wonders of the Ocean Realm. I will link to her work in the show notes. You know, although the immortal jellyfish can kind of regrow itself time and again, it won't actually live forever. You see, because God's creation on earth is cursed by sin, this world and all of its creatures are broken. But God is not going to leave everything broken. He is going to make all things new. God makes it clear in the Bible that this earth of ours is temporary. Do you know what temporary means? Temporary means something will only last for a limited time. It is not permanent. And I know it can be sad to think about this earth ending one day. And we really have no idea when that will be. But we don't have to be scared or even nervous about that. Because our God is a God of hope. And He will make all things new. Listen to Revelation 21, 1 and 5. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth had disappeared, and there was no sea anymore. The one who is sitting on the throne said, "Look, I am making everything new." Listener, did you catch that? Right in the middle. And there was no sea anymore, no ocean, no immortal jellyfish. But God says, "Look, I am making everything new." When my kids ask me what the new earth will look like, I tell them that I don't exactly know. The Bible does not give us very much detail about it. But it is fun to imagine, and I do know that it will be way, way better than this broken earth. I think it will be full of more colors, smells, textures and flavors, and plants and creatures than we can imagine. It will be an incredible expression of God's creativity, beauty, and perfection. Can you imagine exploring that wild and wonderful world? You know, although this earth is temporary, and even the immortal jellyfish will have a last day, we can live forever. Not our physical bodies, those are part of this temporary broken earth, but our souls, the deepest part of who we are, can live forever with God. Listen to these words from Jesus in John 11, 25 to 26. "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will have life even after they die. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." What do you think it means to believe in God? It's not only knowing that He is real. Even the enemy, Satan, and his workers know that God is real. James 2:19 says, "You believe there is one God," but the demons believe that too, and they tremble with fear. Do you know why Satan and his workers tremble with fear? It's because they know God wins. So if Satan and his workers also know that God exists, how can believing in God save us so we can live forever with Him? Here is the difference. God invites us to believe in Him and His perfect Son, Jesus, as our Savior. It's more than only knowing in our brains that God is real. It is knowing deep in our hearts that Jesus is King and that He died to save us. Listen carefully to Romans 10, 9 to 10. "If you declare with your mouth, 'Jesus is Lord,' and if you believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, you will be saved." We believe with our hearts, and so we are made right with God. And we declare with our mouths that we believe, and so we are saved. Listener, this is how we can live forever with God. Have you ever made that decision to believe in Jesus in your heart? To trust that He came to earth and died in your place to pay the punishment for your sins, all so that you can live forever with God. I remember when I made that decision. I was 5 years old when I first understood that Jesus is real and He died to save me, and I chose to follow Him. If you have made that decision, I am rejoicing with you. And if you have not made that decision, I want to encourage you to pray about it and to ask an adult, maybe a parent or a teacher at church, to talk with you about that decision. Because this is the most important decision you can make in life. And trust me, Jesus is worth following. Maybe one day, all of you listeners and I can go on a hike in the new creation and explore God's perfect, wild, and wonderful world. Do you remember our trivia question? What is a group of jellyfish called? There are actually several answers because it turns out a group of jellies has several names, and they are kind of funny. A group of jellies can be called a bloom of jellyfish, which now that we know how a jellyfish grows up from that polyp and kind of blooms into a medusa, that makes sense, a bloom of jellyfish. They can also be called a swarm of jellies, or a smack of jellies, or a flutter of jellyfish. Most scientists call a group of jellies a bloom or a swarm. Now it's your turn to explore. Think about those immortal jellies that really we can't even know how old they are. Go find something very old in nature, or go to the library and get a book to study something very old in nature. It could be a very big tree that has grown in your neighborhood for many years, or you could study or go see a tortoise in a zoo. Or if you remember counting seashell rings from our episode on mollusks and oysters, you could find a seashell and count its rings. Appreciate how God has created many creatures to live a long time, and thank Him for making a way for you to live forever with Him. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to share it with a friend and subscribe, rate, and review Nat Theo wherever you listen. Make sure to check out Sherri's amazing work. And until next time, keep exploring God's wild and wonderful world.